Good morning, scholars, and welcome back to Learning with Mrs. Preby. We're currently working on Fairytales Lesson 1, and our learning goal is I can describe how the 13th fairy feels when she is not invited to the feast using words and phrases that suggest feelings. Over the next couple of weeks, you're going to be listening to stories called fairy tales. A tale is another word for story. And many fairy tales, including the one you're here today, were collected long ago by two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. They're often called the Brothers Grimm. So the brothers lived in a country called Germany, which is right here. Germany. Let's bring it in a little closer. Right here you can see this thin gray line that outlines where Germany is. Right here, this is Germany. Many of the stories we know now as fairy tales had been told orally for many years in this country and in other countries too. The brothers decided to write the stories down to make a book out of them. The brothers thought the book would be interesting because the stories are about things that make people happy, sad, and sometimes afraid. Now, more than 200 years later, people all over the world are still reading the fairy tales that the brothers collected for their book. Your parents and your grandparents probably heard some of these stories when they were young. You may have even heard some of these fairy tales before, but some may be completely new to you. You'll be learning what makes fairy tales different from other kinds of stories. You're going to hear tales with characters including princes, giants, witches, and even animals that can talk. Although some of the things that happen in fairy tales could happen in your own lives, many things that happen in these stories are just fantasy, or a kind of make-believe that can't really happen. You're going to learn how characters' problems are often solved in fairy tales, and you'll have a chance to compare fairy tales to see how they are like and how they are different. Today's fairy tale, and another fairy tale you'll be listening to later, you're going to hear about spinning and spinning wheels. If you participated in the CKLA program for kindergarten, you might be familiar with spinning from your studies of colonial times and townspeople. Spinning wheels, this right here, this is a spinning wheel. It's a tool used to spin thread and yarn. The spindle and the stick-like tool on the spinning wheel right here, this is where it goes, and it comes around, it wraps around this big wheel. Okay, there's a little foot pedal that they use to make it work down here. So once it's spun, it goes here. They're spinning it on here. Okay. People use parts of certain plants such as cotton, flax, and wool from animals like sheep and alpacas, and even hair from certain goats and rabbits to make thread or yarn. You're going to want to take a look at the video that I sent for you about how yarn is made. So go ahead and make sure you review that video, and it'll show you how different strands of yarn are put together to different strands. The thin strands of yarn are meshed together to make one big yarn piece. So it's all twisted together. So many, even they're spun into smaller, they start with really small pieces and they spin it together, and it gets thicker and thicker until they get the thickness and the strength of the yarn that they'd like to have. So most thread and yarn, as you're going to see in that video, are made in machines today. Okay, but some people still use these spinning wheels to make their own thread or yarn. So listen carefully to the fairy tale so you can find out about a problem caused by a spindle. So you might have already heard the story of Sleeping Beauty. But you're going to listen to see if this version of Sleeping Beauty is exactly what you heard before. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who for many years were very sad because they had no child. At last, a little daughter was born to them, and the king was so happy that he planned a great feast in the palace, to which he would invite all his friends and relatives. A feast is a large fancy meal. People sometimes have feasts at parties or celebrations when something special happens. What do you think is on the list the king is carrying? Now in his country there were 13 fairies. Of course, the king wished to invite all of the fairies to the feast too, so they each might look kindly upon his child, and perhaps give the baby a special fairy gift. But as the king had only 12 gold plates for the fairies to eat from, it was decided that one fairy had to be left out. How do you think the 13th fairy is going to feel about not being invited to this feast? How would you feel if you were that 13th fairy? The feast was held. Let's see. Let's count these fairies first. Let's see. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's 12 of them. The feast was held, and what a wonderful celebration it was. As it drew to an end, the fairies came forward to give the child their special gifts. One said to the child, "I give you the gift of virtue, so that you may be good." Another said, "I give you the gift of wisdom, so that you may be wise." Virtue is another word for goodness. Virtue is another word for goodness, and wisdom is the ability to know what is right and to make good choices. A third fairy gave the child the gift of beauty. A fourth gave her riches, and on it went, with each fairy giving everything in the world that one could wish for. 11 of the fairies had given their gifts, and the 12th was just about to speak when suddenly in came the 13th fairy, the one who had been left out. She was very angry, and she cried out in a loud voice, "When the princess is 15 years of age, she shall prick herself with a spindle and die." To prick means to make a small hole or cut with something pointed or sharp, like the needle on a spinning wheel. Without another word, the angry fairy left the hall. Everyone was terrified at what she had said. Then the 12th fairy came forward and said, "I cannot undo the evil spell." A spell is a group of words believed to have magic powers. To spell also means to write or say letters to a word. Say the letters to a word. But I can soften it. Here then is my gift to the child. The princess shall not die, but she will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years. So how did the 12th fairy soften the spell? Right, she said that the child would sleep for 100 years. The king was determined to protect his child. "Surely," he said, "my daughter cannot prick herself with a spindle if she never sees one." So he gave an order that every spindle in the kingdom should be burned. Why does the king want all the spindles in the kingdom burned? Yes, to protect his daughter. You're right. So smart. The princess grew up, and all the fairies' gifts to the children were plain to see. She was good, wise, kind, and beautiful. Everyone who saw her loved her. On the day that she turned 15, the king and queen were away from the palace. The princess was left on her own, and she wandered about the palace, looking into all sorts of places and peeking into rooms that she had never explored before. She climbed a narrow, winding stair that led to a little door with a rusty key sticking out of the lock. She turned the key, and the door opened, and there in the little room sat an old woman with a spinning wheel, busily spinning away. "What do you think's going to happen?" "Good day," said the princess, entering the room. "What are you doing?" she asked, for she had never seen a spinning wheel before. Why had she not seen a spinning wheel before? Yeah, the king ordered all of them to be burned. "I am spinning," said the old woman. The princess stretched forth her hand and asked, "What is this thing that spins around so merrily?" But hardly had she spoken when she pricked her finger on the spinning wheel spindle, and in that very moment she fell into a deep sleep. Why has the princess fallen asleep? At the same time, sleep fell upon everyone in the palace. So here's the milkman sitting there sleeping. That's a milkmaid. Do you remember from fables and stories? What does a milkmaid do? Yeah, she's milking the cows. The king and queen, who had just come home and were in great hall, fell fast asleep. The horses in their stalls, the dogs in the yard, even the pigeons on the roof and the flies on the wall, all fell asleep. Even the fire on the hearth went out. A hearth is the bottom of the fireplace. The wind stopped, and not a leaf fell from the trees. In time, a hedge of thorns began to grow around the castle, which grew thicker and thicker every year, until at last nothing could be seen of the castle, not even the flags on the highest towers. As the years passed, stories spread throughout the land of a beautiful princess sleeping behind a wall of thorns. Many a young prince came, but none could break through the thorns. But at long last, after many, many years, there came into the country a king's son, who heard an old man tell that there was a castle standing behind the hedge of thorns, and that there a beautiful enchanted princess lay sleeping. When something is enchanted, it's under a magic spell. When is the princess's enchantment supposed to end? 100 years after she fell asleep. The prince said, "I shall make my way through and see the lovely princess." The old man warned him that many had tried and failed, but the prince would not listen. For now the 100 years were at an end, and the day had come for the sleeping princess to be awakened. When the prince drew near the hedge of thorns, it changed into a hedge of beautiful flowers, which bent aside to let him pass. When he reached the castle yard, he saw the horses and dogs lying asleep, and on the roof the pigeons were sitting with their heads under their wings. As he entered the castle and climbed up the steps, the prince saw everyone still asleep. The king, the queen, the cook, the maids, everyone. All was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. At last the prince went up the narrow winding stair and came to the room where the princess was sleeping. When he saw her looking so lovely in her sleep, he could not turn his eyes away. He bent down and kissed her, and she opened her eyes and smiled at him. Together they went downstairs, and they saw the king and the queen waking up, and all the people in the castle waking up and looking at each other in great surprise. The horses in the yard got up and shook themselves. The dogs sprang up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof flew into the fields. The flies on the walls buzzed and crept a little further. Even the kitchen fire leapt up and blazed. At last the wedding of the prince and princesses was held with great feasting and rejoicing, and they lived happily together for the rest of their days. At the beginning of the fairy tales, why do you think the king and queen have a feast? I hope you said they were celebrating the birth of their daughter. Who was invited to the feast? Friends, relatives, and 12 of the 13 fairies in the country. What are some of the gifts given to the child by the fairies? The gifts of virtue, wisdom, beauty, and riches. What does it mean to give the gift of virtue? The gift of being good or goodness. Do you think the king makes a good decision not to invite the 13th fairy? It's hard saying. It probably didn't feel very good if you were that 13th fairy. Why is the 13th fairy angry? The fairy is angry because she was not invited to the feast. And what did she do? She did cast a spell on the princess, saying that she will die on her 15th birthday when she pricks her finger on a spindle. How did the 12th fairy, who had not yet given her gift, and then to the king, try to solve or fix the problem of the evil spell? The 12th fairy changed the spell so that the princess will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years instead of dying. The king orders that all spindles in the kingdom should be burned. What happens on the princess's 15th birthday when she finds a spindle? Yes, the princess pricks her finger on the spindle and falls asleep. Why do you think there is still a spindle in the castle after the king said that all of them should be burned? Go ahead and tell somebody who's with you. Pause the video and then come back. Did you pause the video and talk about why you think that she found a spindle? How does this fairy tale end? Right, the prince kissed the enchanted princess on the day of the evil spell ends, and the princess wakes up. Is this a happy ending? Yes, they got married and lived happily ever after. Why do you think this fairy tale is called Sleeping Beauty? Right, the beautiful princess sleeps for 100 years. In this read aloud, you heard another fairy said, I will give you the gift of wisdom so that you may be wise. Say the word wisdom. If someone has wisdom, he or she is granted a lot of knowledge through experience. Owls are known as story characters who have great wisdom. Have you ever known somebody who has shown great wisdom? Go ahead and talk about somebody who has great wisdom with mom or dad or whoever's in the room with you. Pause the video and go talk to them. Did you pause the video and go talk to them? I'll bet you did. All right, so we're going to take a look at this right here. These are the elements of fairy tales. So I'm going to be creating this chart. If you'd like to have a copy of it so you can write down the answers, you can go ahead and send me a dojo message, and I'll send you a link to be able to print this out and then write down the answers yourself. You're not going to be able to read everything you see on here just yet because you're still learning decoding skills. It's okay, you don't have to be able to read it. It will help me remember what we talk about today. Okay? The setting of a story is the time and the place that a story takes place. Many fairy tales begin in a special way that gives us a clue about when the story takes place. So listen carefully as I read the very first sentence. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen for many years that were very sad because they had no child. So this sentence gives us some clues as to when this story actually took place. Once upon a time often begins fairy tales. So when you think about once upon a time, what do you think that means? I hope you said a long time ago. Sorry about my writing. This isn't the best program, but it'll have to work. So a long time ago. So where did this story take place? Now let me see. I'm going to think about this. It was a castle. So I think I'm going to put that here. So let's take a look at this again. And we're going to take a look at the characters. Now characters are who is in the story. So right here we have the king and the queen and the daughter. That's Sleeping Beauty right there. The princess. So, and then here we have the fairies, right? There we go. All 13 fairies. And then here's the old woman. She's a character in the story, right? And then we're going to keep going. We're looking for more characters. Here's a character. He is a prince. So when we're going to go back to here. So here it says real characters and magical characters. Okay. Fairy tales are often about princesses and princes and kings or queens. And people with these titles are called royalty. So kings and queens you may have learned about before. Maybe you read the story of Cinderella or heard other stories about kings and queens. Although characters in fictional stories such as fairy tales are make-believe, most of the characters in Sleeping Beauty are based on real kinds of peoples. For example, there really are kings and queens and princesses and princes in the world. Some characters in fairy tales and the fairies, like the fairies in Sleeping Beauty, are magical creatures who cannot be real people. So fairy tales usually have one or more magical characters. So you're going to learn about additional fairy tale characters and some other fairies that, some other tales that you'll hear. So many fairy tales also have, let's see. So real characters would be the princess. I don't know how I'm going to write all this in here. So there is a prince, a king, a queen, and then there is the princess. 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 And then let me think. Oh, the fairies. So the real kind of characters were in here were the prince or the princess, the king and queen. Oh, and the old lady. Let's put the old lady here. Oops. Let me see if I can't clean that up a little. Old lady. Boy, if I had a real piece of paper and a pencil here, This would be easier, and I hope your writing is not this bad. Old lady. Okay, the old lady. Whoops. That D still doesn't look like a D yet. Let's try this. Okay, and the magical character that we seen in the Sleeping Beauty was the fairies. Terrible writing. I'm so sorry. Okay. So the fairies there. So a lot of fairy tales also have some things that happen that are magic or fantasy. So in this case, the fairies gifts to young princesses. And sometimes these characters are good and evil. Some fantasy events that took place in the story were the fairies. They're not real. So some other fantasy things that sort of happened in this story, the spells, right? So fairies, spells are not real. Oh, the sleeping enchantment. So we talked about the settings being the where did this story take place. It took place in a castle. When? A long time ago. The real characters were the prince, the princesses, then the kings and queens and the old lady. These are all based on like real people. The magical characters were the fairies. The fantasy events that took place in the story that can't really happen were the fairies, the spells, the sleeping enchantment. Those are all fantasy events. So, the problem that this royal family faces in Sleeping Beauty, the 13th fairy's evil spell is going to be our problem. Okay, so what was the solution? So I think that the first part of the solution was when the 12th fairy softened the curse, right? I think the king tried to solve the problem. What did he do? He had burned all the spindles, right? Ugh, I hope you're doing a much better job writing than I am. And then the last part of the solution was when the prince decided to kiss the princess. So I'm just going to put kiss. So that was all of these things were part of the solutions that we had for this story. Okay? So characters in fairy tales always have a problem that must be solved. So that's part of the characteristic of what a fairy tale is. There has to be a problem. So finally, right here, if we look, this word says ending. What happened in the ending of this story? Let's see. I'm going to reread this last sentence of the story. At last, the wedding of the prince and princesses was held with great feasting and rejoicing, and they lived happily together for the rest of their days. So, characters in fairy tales almost always live happily ever after. The fact that most fairy tales have a happy ending is another thing that makes fairy tales different from other kinds of stories. So I'm just going to put it here, the ending, they live happily ever after. All right, so people often refer to happy endings for other things, such as movies or contests and sports games as a fairy tale ending. So you might say, wow, that movie had a fairy tale ending. So you're going to get a chance to hear many more different fairy tales. And we're going to take a look at the similarities and differences among the fairy tales. I want you to take a look right here at this picture. Proverbs are short traditional sayings that have been passed along orally from generation to generation. Although some proverbs do have literal meanings, that is, they mean exactly what they say, many proverbs have a richer meaning beyond the literal level. It's important to help you understand the difference between the literal meaning of the words and the applied figurative meanings. So Have you ever heard the saying, the land of the nod? When someone is in the land of the nod, it is a way of saying that they're asleep. So, have you ever gotten so tired that you started to fall asleep while sitting up and your head kind of bends or dips? Okay, what does that look like? Go ahead and show your mom or dad, whoever's there with you. When your head dips down while you're falling asleep, it's called a nod. So, I'd like to show you what that looks like, but right now, you're just going to have to show me. Okay, okay, enough nodding. Okay. How long was the Princess and the Sleeping Beauty in the land of Nod? Yeah, 100 years. What do you think she might have been most excited to see when she finally woke up or returned from the land of Nod? It's hard saying. I would think her parents, right? I don't know for sure. You might have some different ideas. Go ahead and share them with me on Class Dojo so I know what you're thinking. So, you might say that tonight when you go to bed, you might tell your parents that you're going to enter the land of Nod. So, when else could you say that you were, when else might you use this saying? When do you think you could say the land of Nod? So, today's learning goal was I can describe how the 13th fairy feels when she is not invited to the feast using words and phrases that suggest feelings. So that's it for Fairy Tales Lesson 1. Tomorrow we'll hear about Rumpelstiltskin. Go ahead and tell your family how you think that the 13th fairy is feeling.